China has not officially announced a silver export freeze. And that's exactly why the market is reacting the way it is. Because when China wants to signal urgency without triggering panic, it doesn't use headlines. It uses silence, paperwork, and delay. Over the past several weeks, silver shipments that normally clear routine approvals have started stalling. Licenses are taking longer. Export authorizations are being reviewed. Some shipments are being redirected entirely. On paper, nothing dramatic has happened. In reality, metal is not leaving the country at the pace it should, and markets are starting to notice. This is how supply shocks actually begin, not with press conferences, but with friction. With small interruptions that compound quietly until buyers realize they can get what they assumed was available. That's why analysts are suddenly using language they avoided just months ago. Words like likely, words like inevitable, words like $90. The reason that number matters isn't because it's extreme, it's because it's reachable. A move from current levels to 90 doesn't require hysteria. It only requires confirmation that exports are constrained and that the constraint is intentional. Once that realization sets in, buyers don't wait for clarification. They move to secure supply, and this is where things get uncomfortable. Because China is not just another exporter. It sits at the center of the silver refining and distribution network. When it slows exports, the effect isn't regional, it's global. Manufacturers don't immediately know where the missing silver will come from. Traders don't know whether futures prices still reflect reality, and banks don't know how quickly delivery obligations might cluster. That uncertainty is what drives repricing. Not fear, but urgency. And the timing of this couldn't be worse, because this freeze, whether temporary or structural, is colliding with a moment when inventories are already thin and demand commitments are already locked in. The market doesn't have room for hesitation anymore. That's why the real question isn't whether silver can reach 90, it's what breaks first if it does. To understand why this export freeze matters so much, you have to look at what China actually controls in the silver market. It's not just volume, it's processing. Much of the world's silver doesn't enter global trade in usable form. It leaves mines as concentrate, then moves through refining hubs before it can be used in manufacturing. China sits at one of the most important choke points in that chain. So when exports slow, it's not just raw silver that disappears. It's finished, high-purity material that manufacturers rely on. That's why the impact isn't delayed. It shows up quickly in procurement desks, not price charts. Buyers notice when shipments don't arrive, when quotes change tone, when suppliers stop guaranteeing timelines and start offering estimates instead. This is where analysts start revising probabilities, not forecasts, probabilities. Because once supply is constrained at the refining level, there are very few immediate alternatives. Other countries can mine silver, but they can't instantly replicate capacity, logistics, and throughput. The system wasn't built for redundancy. It was built for efficiency. And efficiency works only when everything flows. As exports tighten, buyers are forced into a decision they don't like making. Do they wait and hope restrictions ease, or do they lock in supply at higher prices now? That decision happens quietly at first. But once enough participants choose certainty over price, the market flips. Prices don't rise because people are bullish. They rise because people are cornered. This is why $90 is being discussed seriously. Not as a ceiling, but as a level where stress becomes visible, where the shortage can no longer be hidden behind paper instruments or optimistic assumptions. When silver trades at that level, it's not signaling excess demand, it's signaling constrained access. And once access becomes the issue, the market doesn't calm down. It accelerates. What makes this moment especially fragile is that most demand for silver cannot be delayed. Industrial buyers don't speculate. They plan production months in advance, lock contracts, and assume material will arrive on schedule. When that assumption breaks, the response isn't patience, it's urgency. Solar manufacturers can't pause panel output without missing government targets. Electronics firms can't redesign components quickly to remove silver. Defense contractors don't substitute materials when reliability matters. These buyers don't care about price momentum. They care about continuity. And when continuity is threatened, they become aggressive. This is the part of the market most traders never see. Futures prices reflect sentiment. Physical markets reflect necessity. When China restricts exports, necessity concentrates. Buyers who were previously invisible suddenly compete in the open market. They bid not because they expect profit, but because the cost of not securing supply is higher than any premium. That's how price behavior changes character. Moves become sharper, pullbacks become shallow, liquidity thins, and volatility rises, not because of speculation, but because fewer sellers are willing to part with metal at any price that feels temporary. This is also when paper markets begin to lag reality. Futures may hesitate, spot prices may stall, but physical premiums widen. Delivery windows stretch, the spread between promise and possession grows, and that gap is where repricing accelerates. $90 doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives when buyers realize they're already late. At this stage, the market stops asking whether exports are frozen and starts asking how long the restriction lasts. That distinction matters. Temporary disruptions can be absorbed, structural ones can't. And China has a history of using ambiguity as a policy tool. It doesn't need to declare a ban to change outcomes. It only needs to keep approvals uncertain long enough for behavior to shift. This is where banks begin to feel pressure. Not because prices are rising, but because obligations start clustering. Settlement dates align. Delivery requests arrive closer together, and the margin for error disappears. Banks can manage volatility. What they struggle with is timing risk. The risk that too many parties ask for the same thing at once. When that happens, institutions quietly adjust. They raise collateral requirements. They encourage cash settlement. They reduce exposure to contracts that imply physical delivery. None of this is announced publicly, but it changes how the market functions. Liquidity looks normal on the surface while stress builds underneath. This is why analysts are careful with their language. They don't say certainty, they say likelihood. They don't say targets, they say scenarios. $90 represents a level where these adjustments become visible to everyone else, where price starts reflecting constraints that were previously managed quietly. And once that line is crossed, the conversation changes. The focus shifts from how high silver might go to how fast the system can adapt. That's when volatility stops feeling speculative and starts feeling structural. What happens next depends less on China and more on how the rest of the market responds to uncertainty. Once buyers accept that exports may remain constrained, they stop waiting for clarity and start acting on worst-case assumptions. That's when demand compresses into shorter timeframes, orders pull forward. Inventories that were meant to last quarters get consumed in weeks. This is also when secondary effects appear. Smaller buyers are priced out first. Larger buyers secure supply at almost any cost. Middlemen reduce exposure, and the price stops responding to good news altogether. Even hints of easing fail to bring relief because trust has already been damaged. The silver market has seen this dynamic before in smaller episodes. Each time, the pattern is the same. Physical tightness appears, paper markets hesitate, then price gaps to where sellers finally emerge. Those gaps don't feel justified when they occur, but they persist because the underlying constraint hasn't been resolved. $90 sits at the intersection of those forces. It's not a prediction, it's a pressure point. A level where enough participants acknowledge that the old assumptions no longer apply. And once that acknowledgement spreads, behavior locks in. That's why the most dangerous moment isn't the announcement of a freeze. It's the quiet acceptance that the freeze is real. Because by then, the market has already moved on. What this ultimately reveals is how fragile the silver market becomes when trust in flow disappears. China freezing exports doesn't need to be permanent to have lasting effects. It only needs to persist long enough for participants to change how they operate. Once that happens, the system doesn't simply revert. It recalibrates at a higher level of caution and cost. If silver does move toward $90, it won't feel like a victory lap. It will feel like the market catching up to a reality it tried to ignore. Buyers will justify higher prices as the cost of certainty. Sellers will hesitate, unsure whether today's price reflects tomorrow's risk. And institutions will focus less on forecasts and more on managing exposure. This is why moments like this matter more than price charts. They expose the difference between theoretical supply and usable supply, between paper availability and physical access. And once that distinction becomes widely understood, the market doesn't behave the same way again. China's role in this process is not about dominance, it's about leverage. When a single node controls enough of the flow, even small policy shifts ripple outward. And those ripples don't stop at borders. They move through supply chains, balance sheets, and expectations. The silver market is now in that phase, where signals matter more than statements, where behavior matters more than headlines, and where price becomes a consequence, not a cause. $90 isn't the end of the story. It's the point where the story becomes impossible to ignore.